Thumbs up back there? Okay, good. Only one announcement, and it's one that was made last week, and we'll probably hear it again next week. And that's the Passover and its high days, as we know, are approaching. And I believe it's less than 2 weeks now, something like that. As a reminder for those attending with us electronically, we will not be broadcasting the Passover ceremony, either on the web or on the conferencing call. In addition, the 2 high days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, we will be broadcasting live on the high days, as well as a few days in between the high days. Excuse me. Let me turn the mic. Much better. Okay. We will be broadcasting on the high days, but only on the internet. We will not be dialing into the conferencing calling number on the high days or on the days in between the high days. We have a abbreviated service on several of the days in between the high days. Has been our tradition for more than 20 years now. So internet only for those. Although I will mention, because we had a new moon gathering this last week, we do observe the new moon, but only in the sense of marking it. It's not a holy day. We don't treat it like a Sabbath or what have you. We just make note of the new moon, usually with a Bible study. This time we watched a documentary that we had also broadcast online, or at least part of a documentary. We did not show the entire thing. And we watched a film produced by Wyatt Archaeological Research titled The Exodus. And after that viewing, we did call in, and we will call in during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the days in between, not the high days, but the days in between. We will dial into the conferencing number that is used for the discussion afterward. There are some people that enjoy that conversation that are at a distance from us and or might not be able to attend, and they like to be able to chat a bit afterward. And so we'll be doing that as our usual during the marking of the new moon. Let's go ahead and open your Bibles to Exodus and chapter 5. Exodus chapter 5. Another reminder is that the Eternal Church of God, we have hosted Bible studies over the years in between the high days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and those studies, as I had mentioned last week before the main message, those studies have consistently gone through selected chapters of the book of Exodus. Now, this year, we have chosen to go back a bit further and to begin those studies earlier. And we began last week with chapter 1, and we went all the way through chapter 4. And we're going to be doing this consecutively as the Feast of Unleavened Bread approaches, and then as we make our way to the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And we'll probably end on or in chapter 14, possibly going into chapter 15 as well, on the last day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, in the message that was given last week, covering the first 4 chapters of the book of Exodus, I did not read all of the scriptures involved in those chapters, and that will be the case today as well, because it would go much longer, and you could give several sermons discussing various aspects or interesting things about any of the chapters of the books of Exodus, or chapters of Exodus. So today we're going to continue in chapter 5, and that'll be the same, as much the same as last week. I will not be reading every verse from the chapters that we are going to go through today. There is going to be paraphrasing, summarizing, and a bit of speculation, if you will, adding food for thought as we continue this series leading up to the Exodus. And so we left off last week, and it was it was timely, I should say, as the poetry readings today, to discuss many of those things or mention some of those things that we had talked about last week. And we left off last week at the end of that message with Moses and Aaron entering Egypt They had gathered together elders of the tribes of Israel and explained to them how God had heard their cries and that they were going to be delivered, set free, finally, after centuries of bondage in Egypt. Now, as proof that Aaron and Moses were not false prophets, they proceeded to perform miracles. And the miracles they performed were the ones that God instructed Moses when he spoke to him at Mount Sinai. And so Aaron had cast down his rod, and the rod turned into a serpent. And then he reached down and picked up the tail of the serpent, and as he lifted it up, the serpent became a rod again. And then a hand was placed in the bosom, kind of like tucking it inside your coat or what have you. It could have been a cloak or a robe, something, some kind of garment that they wore, and he brought it out, and the hand was white, leprous, entirely leprous, putting it back into his bosom and pulling it out again, and it was entirely clean. Would have been a wonderful thing to witness. In the last verse of chapter 4, verse 31, it says, "So the people believed, and when they heard that the Eternal had visited the children of Israel and that he had looked on their afflictions, then they bowed their heads and worshiped." Very joyful and honoring God, humbled, if you will, after all that they had experienced in Egypt for so many years. Now, the next step was to address Pharaoh and to tell him what God would require of the Egyptians. And the royal meeting began with an introduction to Pharaoh as to who he would be dealing with. In verse 1 of chapter 5, "Afterward Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, 'Thus says the eternal God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness.'" So Moses and Aaron are the individuals that Pharaoh would see, and he would hear words spoken from their mouths, but they were representatives of a much higher authority, even higher than Pharaoh, an individual who thought that he was or considered himself to be a type of God in human form on the earth. But the individual Pharaoh would truly be dealing with was the eternal God of Israel, the only, in fact, divine being that has ever existed. And actually, this information that was presented to him is one of the reasons leading up to the events of Israel's exodus, so that the Egyptians and Israel would know that the Eternal is God and there is none else. So this conversation, this initial conversation here, and the ones that follow are documented encounters between Pharaoh, and Moses and Aaron, and other people would have been present, such as, dignitaries in Pharaoh's court or consultants, bodyguards, and some others. And we'll see as we move forward, there are some magicians that are brought into the fold or the mix here of people. But the point that was made initially here is that this is not just a request of Pharaoh. It's more like a demand, that this is something that you are going to be required to do. And it was a demand that was coming from a deity that Pharaoh was unfamiliar with. In verse 2, it says, Pharaoh said, speaking, replying to Aaron and Moses here, "Who is the Eternal, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Eternal, nor will I let Israel go." So Pharaoh's unfamiliarity with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, this is something that was going to be remedied. In so doing, other demands would be made along with a reason for Israel's departure from Egypt. Verse 3 says, "So they said, 'The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice to the Eternal our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword.'" Now it's interesting that God initially said to Pharaoh, let the people go. And the first time it's stated, it's more like a demand. And it was perceived by Aaron and Moses, including the Egyptians, that this was going to, if this didn't happen, something bad was going to happen. Now we have Moses and Aaron saying, please let us go, as if they're asking him to make this happen. And then it says, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword. Now, some might initially read that and think, oh, well, this is a threat not to Egypt, but it's a threat to the Israelites. Let us go, Pharaoh. Our God is going to, bring war upon us and pestilence upon us. However, I believe this is not just a reference to the people of Israel. It's more of a collective us. Please let us go, lest he fall upon us, all of us in Egypt, everyone with pestilence or with the sword. And of course we understand as we go forward, we know the story, but we understand that Israel would be affected by the first plagues that would come upon Egypt. Now there's also mentioned in the verse we had just read, verse 3, a 3 days journey. Now 3 days was first mentioned in Exodus 3 and verse 18, when God had spoken to Moses and gave him instructions about what he desired for him to do. And Aaron and Moses repeated God's demand here to Pharaoh. And 3 days is mentioned again later in chapter 8. Now some have wondered if this period of time is in fact accurate or even honest. Well, I do have an opinion about this, and I'm just mentioning now because we're going to talk about that a bit later. Surprisingly, we will get to the third time that it's mentioned. As we know, the king of Egypt did not comply. He did not appreciate what had happened, how the Israelite workforce had refrained from their labors, anticipating being set free. And Pharaoh therefore advised taskmasters to stop giving the brickmaker straw in order to make the brick. And yet he required the same quota of brick to be fulfilled every single day. And this, of course, made the labor even more difficult for Israel. Now, it's interesting that to note something that if we haven't thought of before, but some of us I'm sure may have thought of this, and it is mentioned, in fact, briefly in the scriptures, that the slaves did much more than make brick for Egypt. Interestingly, there is archaeological evidence of Hebrew people working in ancient Egyptian quarries. I thought that was very interesting. And they are noted, of course, in the scriptures as being the main source of building a minimum of 2 cities. And of course, those cities would include temples and monuments and what have you. Now, some of this was pointed out in a documentary that's titled The Moses Controversy. And it's one that we do have in the Eternal Church of God library. If anybody has not seen it, I recommend it. It's very interesting. And it also says in chapter 1 and verse 14 that we had read last week, or maybe we didn't read it, but it was mentioned, that the Israelites worked, and I quote, in all manner of service in the field. So this is talking about agriculture. They were farmers. They provided food for the people of Egypt. Tens of thousands of Israelites, in fact, lived in the breadbasket of Egypt, the land of Goshen, and they had access to a variety of food. And we see evidence of that later, and we're not going to go there. Maybe we'll read it in one of the other messages. But Numbers chapter 11 and verse 5 talks about the Israelites in the wilderness complaining about a lack of variety of food in the wilderness. And they reminisced about the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic, those things that they ate freely in Egypt. And so clearly they had access to much more than scraps, being slaves. I had also watched a humorous but yet factual documentary several years ago, and this was a documentary titled How Beer Saved the World. It's kind of a funny phrase for a documentary, but it gets your attention. You're like, what's that about? But it just basically goes through the history of beer making or ale making down through time. And in this documentary, they actually showed evidence that Egyptian slaves, which would include the Israelites, that they were given daily portions of unfiltered beer or ale. And this was because it was very high in caloric content. And it would be something that would be very helpful in needing a constant, strong workforce for the people of Egypt. But it appears from what Pharaoh had decreed here, that brick making, this was one of the primary tasks of the people of Egypt. And when you think about an empire like that, the largest empire of its time, the strongest and most powerful empire in that period of history, bricks were needed in large numbers throughout the empire, and it would require a large amount of people to constantly be focusing on the mixing of clay and sand and water and fibrous organic material such as straw, and also then moving the bricks from one place to another. This would take a great deal of work and effort. And I've actually seen videos. You can look this up. You can look on a search engine, go on YouTube, what have you, and there are a few videos of people that make this type of brick, even today. And it appears to be, I've never tried it, it appears to be very tiring, laborsome, and backbreaking, and knee-wrenching. And this is something that the Israelites had to take care of. And so the workload of making bricks would now increase, and also the officers of Israel overseeing the workforce, they were beaten by Pharaoh's soldiers, beaten because of what he called idleness. So the officers, they met with Moses and Aaron, and they were very upset with the result of this first meeting. It certainly did not go as they had expected, and the meeting did not even go as at least Aaron and Moses had hoped. In Exodus 5, in verse 22, Moses returned to the Eternal and said, "Lord, why have you brought trouble upon these people? Why is it you have sent me?" So this is tormenting him mentally here. "For since I came to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has done evil to this people. Neither have you delivered your people at all." Now God answered Moses as he spoke to him. And in the response that God gave to Moses, he said several things, such as, "I am the Eternal. I am the one who appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty." And then in verse 3, I'm not going to read it, but in verse 3, he responds with what I believe is a rhetorical type of question. And I'm not going to go into the details of why I believe it's rhetorical, but we can talk about that later if anyone is interested. In verse 6 of Exodus 6, "Therefore say to the children," this is God speaking to Moses, "say to the children of Israel, I am the Eternal. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Eternal, your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Eternal." Closing it with, it's a guarantee. I'm the Eternal. I said I'm going to do it. I am going to do this. Now at this point, the words Moses relayed from God, these words, he spoke it to the people, and they were not well received. They had heard something similar before all of this began, and the result was increased anguish, was heavier burdens laid upon them, and it seemed that their hope of a better life was being crushed. or so they thought. And this brings up an interesting point. An interesting point for those living at the end of the age. You see, there are many types in the events leading to the Exodus. And these types foreshadow things that not just that came to pass then, not that just came to pass hundreds of years later, but also events that are yet to unfold. But before deliverance from the bondage due to sin in this world, it's going to get more difficult for many people. My father and I were talking about this last week, or perhaps it was the week before, about things getting worse before they are going to get better. And I know we say that and we understand that, but do we really grasp how it might get worse for you personally? For me personally? Have you ever thought about that? There's going to be more difficult times to come. And there's a coming time of persecution upon Israelite nations. It's referred to in Jeremiah 30 and verse 7 as the time of Jacob's trouble. And there is also going to be a persecution upon genuine Christians. Christ spoke of this in Matthew 24 and verse 9, where he said that people are going to be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And it's going to be more than just a feeling of hate. So what have you think about? It's good to think about this. What are we going to do when those extremely difficult times come? Will we be faithful? Will we persevere when those times come? Or are we going to resent the hardships that come upon us and look to blame somebody else as the reason, as did Israel? You know, we are going to see a mixed bag of responses from people when those times come, because I've said this before and I'll probably say it again. You and I, the people of God, the church of God, we are more like Israel than we might want to believe. Those people are our people. They represent God's people unto this day. Exodus 6 and verse 13. Then the Eternal spoke to Moses and Aaron and gave them a command for the children of Israel and for Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to bring the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt. So this is noting that God put Aaron and Moses in charge of the situation. After this verse that we had just read, and I'm not going to read through the next verses, but beginning in verse 14, there is a documentation of the heads of the tribes of Reuben and Simeon. And it's stated, and this is just my opinion, it's stated as though it's almost like sub-tribes within the tribe of Reuben and sub-tribes within the tribe of Simeon, but perhaps just pointing out who would be leaders of those tribes. In any case, after that, there is a genealogy from Levi, the son of Jacob, unto the birth of Moses and Aaron. Now, I'm not certain as to why only Reuben and Simeon are mentioned, and only, some of their sons. This is something that, again, I would it would be nice if anybody has an opinion. I've read several commentaries, and you can't always trust commentaries when it comes to spiritual insight, but when it comes to facts of history and what have you, you can look at commentaries for some helpful information, but nobody really understands why only Reuben and Simeon are mentioned. But it is evident, at least to me, why a chronology, if you will, of the descendants of Levi unto Moses and Aaron is mentioned, because he put those two in charge. And so I think this was likely recorded to authenticate the fact that, well, not only did God speak to Moses personally, but they were Levites. They were from a tribe that God would later put in charge of being priests for the entire nation of Israel. And so After this, the next step, and I believe this was recorded likely later. I don't think Moses was recording all of these events as they happened in Egypt. I think that he recalled what happened and documented these events later. But after God gave further instructions to Moses and Aaron in chapter 6 and verse 13, the next step was to go to Pharaoh and to perform a miracle. A miracle as evidence that these two individuals were in fact prophets that were sent by the only true God. In verse 1 of chapter 7, so the Eternal said to Moses, "See, I have made you as God to Pharaoh." Not as God as in the God, but like a God, a representative of God to Pharaoh. "And Aaron your brother shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron your brother shall tell Pharaoh to send the children of Israel out of his land. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart and multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not heed you, so that I may lay my hand on Egypt and bring my armies and my people, the children of Israel, out of the land of Egypt by great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Eternal, when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them." Then Moses and Aaron did so, just as the Eternal commanded them, so they did. And Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke to Pharaoh. So before the royal audience, they went before Pharaoh again, and Aaron had performed this miracle that he had performed to the elders of the tribes of Israel, where he threw down the rod and it turned into a snake, and then reaching down, picking up the tail of the snake, and it would turn into a rod again. But that second portion did not happen this time. It's just the first part. He threw it down and it turned into a serpent, and there it lay. And we know it lay there because of what happened next. So after this miracle was performed, Pharaoh called some of his magicians. And these individuals, two of which are later referred to by name as Jannes and Jambres, and that's in 2 Timothy 3 and verse 8, they performed a like miracle. Wow, impressive. Now, it has long been wondered if theirs, the magicians that is, was a demonic miracle, something supernatural that is, or perhaps more like a trick, like magicians of today, a sleight of hand, an illusion to make it appear as though it was supernatural. Now, we cannot know for certain, but there are a few things to consider. The first one is that when these magicians are mentioned, and it's in verse 11 of chapter 7, the word translated as magician comes from kartom, meaning a diviner or an astrologer, and some definitions say a horoscopist, which in our English language is not a correct term, but astrologer would be a term that we are familiar with. You know, the horoscopes, they deal with horoscopes. Now, those are all forbidden practices by God's people. They are practices where people attempt to become familiar with spirits other than God, dark spirits. But we also recognize that those practices of those people, that they are vastly built upon tales and superstition. So astrology is, for example, is a creation of men that attempts to connect the natural world to supposed supernatural beings, like Hercules and Gemini and these other things that are described in astrology or in the horoscope. Now it says in verse 11 that the magicians of Egypt, they also did in like manner with their enchantments. And you can take that verbatim, that they performed the same miracle or a similar miracle. Interestingly, enchantments is a term that refers to sorcery, astrology, or today we might call it witchcraft. However, there is an interesting definition to this term that means a blaze, as in flaming, something that is burning, a flame, or smoke that comes from a flame. And this made me think of something that you and I have all seen before. I think all of us have probably seen this take place, where a magician will appear to throw something down on the ground, and there's a small little explosion, and a large poof of smoke comes up, and when the smoke disappears, there's something appears, a miracle. Something just happened. All of a sudden, whoa, that wasn't there before. It looks like something supernatural happened. But we know it's a trick. Sleight of hand. It's an illusion. However, it may be, there is, of course, the possibility, and I think it's a strong possibility, that these magicians were sorcerers, if you will, dabbling in witchcraft, and they in fact had become familiar with a power of demons. Now we know that God allows Satan a measure of ability to interact with certain people at times, or to do certain things at times. Now it could be that this was one of those times. And this is another aspect of the Exodus that is prophetic. If you have a ribbon or a marker, put it here in Exodus chapter 7, and we are going to go all the way back to the last book of the Bible, Revelation in chapter 11. You see, Moses and Aaron, they are also a type of forerunners, if you will. They foreshadowed work that will be done by two individuals referred to as the two witnesses. And these two witnesses at the end of the age, they will be given the ability to perform miracles. Supernatural events will take place at their bidding. Even many of the plagues that we are going to read about as we go through the chapters of Exodus, they reflect plagues at the end of the age. Now, Revelation chapter 11, and beginning in verse 3, speaks about these two individuals, where it says, "And I will give power to my two witnesses." And then it talks about a period of time that they will prophesy. And if you go down to verse 5, continuing to speak of these two witnesses, it says, "And if anyone wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, they must be killed in the same manner." And then it goes on. It continues to say, "These have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of their prophecy. And they have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire." Sounds a lot like Aaron and Moses, doesn't it? So on the side of demonic forces, we have likely, possibly, Pharaoh's magicians, and they also foreshadow something that will take place in the future, that there will be a beast and false prophet, and they will perform miracles, but not miracles that are given by the power of God. They will merely be allowed by God to take place. Now, if you turn over a page to chapter 13 and verse 11, it speaks about this in John's vision here. He said he saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had two horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. I think he is seeing a vision of a beast that represents Satan. He spoke like a dragon, a depiction of Satan in another verse. And these two horns, I think, is portraying two sides of the beast power, a church and state combination. And it goes on to say in verse 12, "And he exercises all authority of the first beast in his presence, and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose deadly wound was healed. And he performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs, which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast. Granted to do. Telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast that was wounded by the sword and lived. And he was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, and that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the beast to be killed. And so here we have, again, similar to some of the miracles that were or would be performed by the magicians of Egypt. Jannes and Jambres, two. A dark side, if you will. Satan's two witnesses, if you will. And we know that this is going to happen. You and I believe that it is going to happen, but part of our knowing that it is going to happen is because it already did. It happened before in the form of Moses and Aaron confronting Pharaoh and the magicians. Pharaoh, in this story, he's a type. He portrays the devil, a beast rising up out of the ocean, a leader of people, a nation of people. And of course, his magicians, a type of beast and false prophet. And so let's go back to Exodus 7. There is another interesting point about this first miracle before Pharaoh, and it's this. We are very familiar with this. Many others have talked about it. We've talked about it numerous times over the years, is that there were these gods of Egypt that were discredited during the miracles and the plagues. Ejo, E-J-O, is the name of a serpent or snake god of Egypt, or was a god of Egypt. Obviously a false deity, wasn't a real god. Heptet was another god for the protection of Egypt, and both of these were discredited when the serpent of Aaron's rod went about to devour the serpents of the other rods that were thrown down by the magicians. And if you can imagine something like that happening, I don't know if you've ever seen any footage of a serpent swallowing another animal, a mouse or what have you, or some of them have swallowed rather large animals. This actually happened. And when it did occur, Pharaoh's heart was hardened because his forces appeared to be defeated in this confrontation, if you will. This must have been humiliating for him. And Pharaoh therefore refused to let the people go. And so Moses left after this miracle had taken place, and God told him what to do next. Now, it was known that Pharaoh made ritualistic visits to the river Nile. Moses was instructed to go out in the morning at a time and to a place where he knew Pharaoh would be down by the river, and to go to the bank of the river and to lift up the rod over the river, and a miracle would take place. And that must have been very dramatic. In verse 17 of chapter 7, "Thus says the Eternal, by this you shall know that I am the Eternal. Behold, I will strike the waters which are in the river with the rod that is in my hand, and they shall be turned to blood." And so this is what Moses would say to Pharaoh as he lifted up the rod over the river, standing on a bank of the river. The drama of that must have been chilling. And it's still to this day, I hope there's some kind of like reminiscing night or something in the kingdom where we can actually have a vision or see that how this actually played out. And sure, God can just put a thought in your mind and you can picture how it happened, but I guess, we're still physical, and watching old home videos of the family and such is kind of fun and nostalgic, but it'll be great to be able to see how this played out when these miracles were unleashed. So the water turned to blood at that point, and I wonder about that if it all turned at once, if like all the waters all of a sudden just started turning pinkish and then just turned red all at once. I guess if you're mixing red with kind of a bluish color, it'd probably turn what, Mia? Purple first, right? Turn purple and then red, like blood. Blood that, when oxygen hits the blood, it turns red. But we don't know if it took place like that, or if perhaps maybe a little more dramatic would be like an underwater cloud that started to form and it just kind of spread and everything turned to blood from one central location. Not exactly sure how that played out, but I'm sure it was very dramatic and moving. Now, soon after that took place, as God had said, the fish died. It wouldn't be long after all these fish died and floated to the surface and washed to the banks of the river that it would start to smell very badly. God says it will stink throughout the land of Egypt. Now, this turning the water to blood not only occurred in the river, it happened in streams, it happened in ponds, it happened in pools of water, it happened in basins, buckets made of wood, or pottery vessels that they used to hold water. They all turned to blood. Now the magicians of Pharaoh, they were summoned and they did something similar. Now again, we don't know if what they did was supernatural or perhaps a trick like throwing powdered dye into water and it would all the water would be dyed, or if perhaps they were just riding on the coattails of Aaron and Moses. I mean, how would you tell, actually? If they already turned all the waters to blood, how would you tell if the magicians were able to do the same thing since it was already turned to blood? But I'm not really sure, but they did something, and I lean toward it was likely miraculous, given the fact that the beast and false prophet are going to be given the ability to perform demonic miracles. But in any case, the people could not drink the water, and so they were forced to dig pits around the banks of the river or around pools of water so that the liquid could be filtered through the soil into something where they could get out drinkable or potable water. And for those of you who are not aware, soil is a great purifier of water, and I forget the number of feet. I think it's like 10, 20, is it 10, 20? I'm not sure, but it's somewhere between 10 and 20 feet of soil is enough to purify water so that it's potable. In fact, soil is a great, it's the largest natural filter on the planet, is soil. Again, if you have a ribbon or a marker, put it here and let's go back to Revelation. I want to read something briefly in Revelation chapter 8. This plague of turning the water to blood, it insulted the Egyptian deity Nun. It was a water god that the Egyptians say assisted in creating the earth. They had a god of water and a god of soil and or land and what have you. In fact, the Nile itself had many false gods associated with it. It is said of Osiris, we're very familiar with that god being one of the ones that turned into a god that was honored during Easter celebrations. Osiris was said to have a bloodstream that flowed from the Nile. Hopi was another god of water, and we're also familiar with the Assyrian god Dagon. Now, it's not, I don't know whether or not Dagon came from Assyria or if Egypt created this god first. It's not known, but we do know that the Catholic Church, they fashioned some of their famous headgear after this pagan god, Dagon, a fish god. Now this plague also represents something that will take place during the great and terrible day of the Lord, the year of his wrath. In Revelation 8 and verse 8, it says that the second angel sounded, and this is the trumpet plagues here. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood, and a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So much like the Nile, the river turning to blood and the fish in the Nile dying. Something like that is going to happen again, but on a much larger scale. And I wonder if the ships being destroyed is because God destroys the ships, or if it's because I don't know how many of those ships would function in the consistency of an ocean that now turns to the consistency of blood. I think it'll likely clog a lot of things up, and a lot of these ships will sink. But that's just an opinion. Another plague in chapter 16 of Revelation. And this is the second bowl plague, that something similar to the second trumpet plague will take place, where it says in verse 3, the second angel poured out his bowl on the sea, and it became blood as of a dead man, and every living creature in the sea died. So now, first a third of the creatures would die, and now everything in the ocean dies. And when that takes place, the pH, if you will, of the ocean is going to drastically change, and it is going to throw a lot of things out of balance. If you imagine the largest ecosystem on the planet changing, it's going to throw a lot of other things on the planet out of balance. So many are going to be moved by this when these plagues are unleashed, the trumpet plagues and the bowl plagues. But some will be not, or some, should I say, some will not be moved, at least to the point where they need to be. And such as was the case with Pharaoh, whose heart hardened again due to his pride, due to his ego. And this is why going through these chapters and talking about these events is a fitting setup for the celebration of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, because it has much to do with eliminating the puffed up pride of life. And that affects us all. Some more than others, but it affects every one of us. It's something that we constantly have to be on guard about, something we have to consistently work on. And so let's go back to Exodus chapter 8 this time. We are moving along here. 7 days had passed since the water was changed to blood. And the first two verses I'm going to read of Exodus chapter 8, verse 1, and the Eternal spoke to Moses, saying, Go to Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Eternal, Let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all your territory with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into your house, into your bedroom, and your bed, into the house of your servants, on your people, and your ovens, and into kneading bowls. And so Egypt would be inundated with frogs. Now, there are 7 species of Nile frogs that, when I looked this up, 7 species of Nile frogs today in Egypt. I don't know how many there may have been at that time, but regardless of the variety of frog or type of frog, if you've ever held a frog, anybody ever held a frog? Yeah, it's not really pleasant. Oh, you might like them, you might think they're cute or something, but let's be honest, they're not pleasant to touch. They're slimy, they kind of leave a little bit of a film on your hand when you set them down. But frogs would be so numerous that they would be found everywhere, even in your bed, it says. And that would be very unpleasant. Now, the magicians, after this occurred, the magicians did likewise. They performed a like miracle. Now, whether or not they were riding on the coattails of Aaron or Moses is not known, but it appears similar, albeit, I think, less dramatic than the miracle that was performed at the hands of Aaron and Moses. And such will be the case also with the beast and false prophet. Heket was a frog goddess of germination that was worshipped by the Egyptians, and this false god was discredited. Other Egyptian deities disparaged in this plague were Nyau and Keket, and this plague, this particular one, seemed to be a point where it began to tug at Pharaoh's heartstrings. Now, I don't know if he actually felt compassion for the people that were experiencing this plague or simply sorry for himself at this point, but it bothered him. It bothered him to the point of relenting. In verse 8 of Exodus chapter 8, then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Entreat the Eternal that he may take away the frogs and from me and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may sacrifice to the Eternal." And so a time was decided during this conversation, and Moses went and asked God to remove the plague of frogs, and they were removed. The Lord did according to the word of Moses. This is verse 13. And the frogs died out of the houses and out of the courtyards and out of the fields. See, they were everywhere. They gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank, first of dead and rotting fish, now of dead and rotting frogs. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart, and he did not heed them, as the Eternal had said. So the Eternal said to Moses in verse 16, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your rod and strike the dust of the land so that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt." And they did so. For Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod and struck the dust of the earth, and it became lice on man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout the land of Egypt. This would be more than just discomforting or bothersome. Geb, G-E-B, G, the letter G, G-E-B is an Egyptian god, or was an Egyptian god of the land, and this god was shown to be just a figment of imagination, of legends and tales, because the deity remained silent. The land was not protected. In addition, having lice was thought to be a form of defilement for temple worship, and this would place further restrictions upon the Egyptians. Pharaoh's magicians were again called, and they attempted to mimic the miracle of turning dust to lice, but they could not do it this time. And you would think, well, hey, here's a good magic trick. Let's turn the lice back into dust. How about that? But that wasn't attempted as far as we know anyway. So the discomfort of lice, this did not soften Pharaoh's heart, just as the Eternal had predicted. In verse 20 of chapter 8, the Eternal said to Moses, "Rise early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water, and say to him, 'Thus says the Eternal, let my people go, that they may serve me. Or else if you will not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies on you and your servants, on your people, and into your houses. The houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also on the ground where they stand. And in that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the Eternal in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and your people, and tomorrow this shall be a sign.'" And then the insects came. They came in thick swarms. Now notice, I don't know about your translation, but I think it's probably like this in most translations, if not all, that the words flies or the flies is in italics, and this means that they were added later. And so it's basically saying that swarms will come. And the term swarms is from the Hebrew arob, meaning swarms of insects. And I think that flies were likely included if not perhaps a primary source of the swarms, but I believe this is an indication that there were swarms of other insects that would have came upon the land as well, such as the famous or infamous beetles that Egyptians frequently made what's called scarabs, I believe, that represented one of their gods. In Exodus 8 and verse 24, and the Eternal did so. Thick swarms came into the house of Pharaoh, into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted because of the swarms. Corrupted basically means the land was spoiled, it was marred, greatly stricken because of these swarms of insects. So they were more than just annoying, they were problematic for the Egyptians. Now at this point, we see that God began to protect the Israelites, protect particularly the people in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh was bothered by this to the point of relenting and agreeing to let the people go. But he didn't want them to go very far. In verse 25 it says, Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God in the land." Now, Pharaoh tried to make alterations to God's demands, but his alterations were not acceptable to God for several reasons. And Moses replied in verse 27, "We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Eternal our God as he will command us." Now, I'm going to get back to something I mentioned at the beginning of this message, because it has been thought by some that God, through Aaron and Moses, was being deceitful, that he wasn't being entirely honest here about this 3-day journey thing. Some have actually thought that this meant that God or Moses was implying that we'll go 3 days, we'll do our thing, and then we're going to come back. We'll come back to you, Pharaoh, and continue our work for you. Well, there are several reasons why I do not believe that this was the case, that it was not deceitful and it was not a lie. First, in every instance where a 3-day journey is mentioned, when he first mentioned it when speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, speaking to him from the burning bush that was not consumed, and then when it was mentioned the first time and at the beginning of this message today, we saw it in verse 3 of chapter 5, and now right here, verse 27. When this 3-day journey is mentioned, there is never a statement, notice never a statement saying, "and then we will return." That's never said. No indication they would come back at all. And I believe that Pharaoh actually knew this. He understood what they were saying when they said, "We're going to go 3 days journey." And in verse 28, Pharaoh actually said, "I will let you go, only you shall not go very far." In other words, he's trying to alter it. Not 3 days. You're not going to go very far, because he wanted to be able to send out his armies to bring them back. That was unacceptable, obviously. In addition, a 3-day journey indicates that it would take 3 days just to get to a place where they might stop and have some worship services, making sacrifices to the Eternal. Now, another point that should be made is that the wilderness that is spoken of to journey 3 days into is not mentioned. And so what wilderness was he talking about? Because there were several wildernesses around that region. There is the wilderness of the Red Sea, and that's the peninsula between the Gulf of Suez and the Gulf of Aqaba. That's on the Egypt's borders. But that was not Israel's destination. God wanted them to go back to the mountain where Moses had spoken to God from the burning bush. In chapter 3 and verse 12 of Exodus, it says, "When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." And so that was the destination where God had planned for them to go. So the plan for Israel was to go to Midian, where Moses had first spoken to God. And this is after, or would be after, crossing the Red Sea. And so Moses, in chapter 15 and verse 22 of Exodus, it says that Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and it says they went into the wilderness of Shur, S-H-U-R. So that's another area that is also called a wilderness, and yet it's not the place where Mount Sinai is located. That area is called Horeb in the scriptures. It's also known as the wilderness of sin. So now we have at least 3 different wildernesses spoken of in the scriptures. And even after they crossed the Red Sea and went into the wilderness of Shur, it was another several weeks before they arrived at the mountain. Something else to consider is that the 3 days journey was a proposal that God had made. However, God knew that Pharaoh would not agree to this. It's kind of like when he told Moses, I'm going to kill all of the Israelites because of their worship of the golden calf, and I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Would God have followed through? Or did God know? Moses would say, no, please, please, please. I love these people. They are my people. They are your people. Don't do this. And so God proposed this, but he understood that Pharaoh would not agree. It's kind of like a stranger coming to your door and knocking on the door very politely, maybe perhaps they're well-dressed, and saying, excuse me, can I have all of the money in your bank account? Nobody's going to agree to that, right? It's a proposal, but you're not going to agree to do that. God knew that Pharaoh would harden his heart, and he would not agree to set free the largest workforce of his empire. Therefore, when Pharaoh finally relented, as we will see, the terms proposed for going 3 days' distance, these are no longer mentioned. They no longer apply because the agreement has changed now. The initial demands, they are different. Now you're just going to let the people free. There's no going 3 days and worshiping and not coming back. We're just going to continue. And beginning in chapter 9, we'll read this next week. Beginning in chapter 9, it simply says, let my people go, that they may serve me. So, as before, the pattern of Pharaoh hardening his heart would continue in verse 32 of chapter 8. But Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. So once again, we see there was a time of respite. Things were kind of getting back to somewhat of a norm, if you will, and Pharaoh therefore reverted back to his stubbornness. It's easy for you and I to read through these scriptures and shake our heads and go, man, how could anybody continue to fight against God like this? How could anybody have such pride and ego? Now you'd think that he would have learned this lesson the first time, the second time, the third, or the fourth time. However, consider the fact that you and I, many of us, are still learning this lesson. Perhaps not to the degree that Pharaoh needed to, but we are still learning these lessons about pride and about ego, which is why the coming holy days are observances that were commanded to be kept continually. Never stop. The final scripture I would like to read is Proverbs 16. Proverbs 16. We see that pride is still a big problem. A big problem for everyone. We all have a degree of human nature. And I heard it interestingly put yesterday that we all have human nature and we all have our own nature. And so there is a human nature that all of us struggle with. And this has to do with the pride of life, which is something that we must fight against all of our lives. And this type of pride is something that we see those people that are not genuine Christians, they struggle with perhaps even more. Millions have promoted pride as something that is positive, something that you should embrace, that you should feed your pride. Homosexual pride, transsexual pride, proud to be black, proud to be white, proud to be a Muslim. But pride is not a good thing. You can be glad about something. That's different. But being proud, it's a character flaw. It's not positive at all. The scriptures never portray pride or ego positively. Never. The Bible calls it a stony heart. When speaking of the Israelites after they come out of Egypt, he talks about them being stiff-necked, stubborn. And a great proverb to consider at this time, and all the time, is Proverbs 16, verse 18, where it says, "Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty or elevated spirit before a fall. Better to be of a humble spirit with the lowly or the poor in spirit than to divide the spoil with the proud." So we know this, right? This is not news to us. It's something we are all aware of, and yet we still struggle with it. We still stumble on occasion, and such as would be the case with Egypt. And then, of course, when Israel finally came out of Egypt, they would struggle with it as well. Throughout the wilderness of sin, they had to deal with it, just as you and I have to deal with it. It is the theme of the days of unleavened bread, to let go of the ego, to become humble and flat like an unleavened piece of bread, and not puffed up like a decorated donut. No matter how much we might think we know or we understand about God or the Bible, about how we think we might live, the scriptures say that the foolishness of God is far wiser than man. And so let's listen to God when it comes to the type of behaviors, the things that you and I should do in life. Let's continue to focus on this theme as we count down to the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then next week we're going to continue discussing events leading to the Exodus.